Seudah Berisuni mit Mitzrayim mit Mitzrayim mit Mitzrayim gejat und was Seudah Berisuni mit Mitzrayim mit Mitzrayim
The first unique event of this very unique year of Erev Pesach Shechal Lihiyot B'Shabbat is the fast of the firstborn. Usually the fast comes out on the eve of Pesach, but this year the eve of Pesach is Shabbos. So, taking the model of Tanis Esther that can come out on Shabbos when Purim is on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night and Sunday, indeed, it seems like we can take the same model to here. Just like Tanit Esther is a fast to remember events of way back when, Tanit Bechorim, Tanit Bechorot seems to be the same. It's to remember the fact that the firstborns were spared way back when during the plague of the firstborn. So, taking that model, the Rambam paskins that indeed, if the fast comes out on Shabbos, you push it back to Thursday. But there's a difference of opinion as to why. The Lechem-Mishneh says, very simply, because we do not go ahead and make a fast that's not on time on Friday. Friday is a day that should be devoted towards preparations of Shabbos, and it has an importance in and of itself. And therefore, if a fast comes out on Friday, like Asara B'Tevis, we do fast, but we do not push back a fast to Friday, and therefore, like Tanit Esther, we push it back to Thursday. However, the Torah disagrees. He says the reason that on Tanit Esther we pushed the fast back to Thursday and not fast on Friday is because usually on a fast day you say that a lot of slichos in shul. Davening took a long time, and we didn't want to stay in shul so long because people have to prepare for Shabbos. Obviously, the ramification would be Tanit Bechoros. We don't have any slichos for this particular fast, so therefore, according to the Torah, there'd be no problem to do it on Friday. But according to the Lechem-Mishneh, you never make a fast that's not on time on Friday, and that should be the same for the fast of the firstborn. So, la halacha, there is not one, not two, but actually three opinions on this. The Meiri, in his famous book Magen Avot, which means defending my forefathers, defending the customs of Provence where he lived, said, we fast on Friday, and there's no problem with it. Probably, taking the point of view of the Torah, there's no slichos anyway. You'll have plenty of time to prepare for Shabbos as well as for Pesach. However, the Trumas Hadeshin brings two opinions. One, that if the fast comes out on Shabbos, the fast doesn't exist at all, namely there's no fast this year. And the second opinion is, of course, like Tanit Esther, Thursday. La halacha, the Shulchan Aruch brings the last two opinions. He says, Yeshomim, some say that the fast is on Thursday, and some say that the fast doesn't exist at all. And the Ramah comes along and says that you should basically act like the first of the two, namely the fast comes out on Thursday. So for all sakes and purposes, we're going to assume that the fast of the firstborn this year will come out Thursday, April 10th, 2 days earlier than it usually does, which leads to the final and wonderful question. Well, since it comes out so early, should we be as lenient as regular years? Aruch HaShulchan says that the reason that people go and hear a siyum and afterwards eat at the Seudah mitzvah and basically don't fast the fast of the firstborn, namely I don't know of anyone that's a firstborn that actually fasts this fast, is because it's very difficult to have a whole day of preparations for the Seder, and then at the Seder itself, you can't break your fast right away. There's the first cup of wine, then there's Magid. By the time you eat, it takes a very long time. And therefore, we were so mekel and said, if you hear a siyum, even if you didn't learn the Masechet, it's good enough. Well, this year, since it's 2 days earlier, and that night is not the Seder night, maybe we should be more stringent and tell people, well, this year you should fast. And indeed, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, former chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, did contemplate that. He said that since this year there is no Seder at the end of the fast. Maybe we should be more machmir and ultimately tell people, well, that wonderful siyum idea, that exemption that you use every year, is not relevant this year. However, he said that Rav Kook, of all people, told him that can't be. That can't be simply because what you're going to do is make the tafel more important than the ikar. Namely, that when the regular fast comes out on Erev Pesach, you allow people to exempt themselves via a siyum. But when we make it 2 days early, namely, it's a mukdam, you're going to be more stringent? That doesn't make sense. Usually anytime a fast is moved from its original day, we're more lenient. And therefore, he says, that can't be. And indeed, Rav Moshe Feinstein says exactly the same thing, basically assuming that A, this whole fast is a minhag, B, it's not on its regular day, and C, there is that point of view that says there is no fast this year. And Rav Ovadia Yosef concurs. Rav Ovadia Yosef says that even though the halacha seems to follow, as per his rules, that, according to the Shulchan Aruch at least, there is no fast this year, people should go out of their way to try to hear a siyum on Thursday, but he says you don't have to go nuts. For example, if a father usually fasts on behalf of his son, he doesn't have to do that this year. If a girl, firstborn, usually is stringent, she doesn't have to do that this year. So to sum up, the fast of the firstborn will be on Thursday, 2 days early, April 10th. You can definitely go to a siyum and even be more lenient than usual because the fast is not on time. This unique year, and that is Bedikat Chametz. On this unique year, Bedikat Chametz will not take place on the night before Pesach, which is Friday night, but rather it will take place 2 nights before Pesach, Thursday night, April 10th. So, in this particular case, the halacha is very clear. That's when we do Bedika, and we treat it like as if we were doing it the night before Pesach. The Shulchan Aruch paskins it, and the Mishnah Berurah says you make a bracha and you say the Kol Chamira v'Chamira afterwards. Everything's the same. If for some reason you weren't home that night, then you do Bedika on Friday, Erev Shabbos, up until Shabbos. Try to make the house dark and use a flashlight or a candle, and you make a bracha. This is learned out from a halacha that if you didn't do a bedika, if you didn't do a check and Pesach already finished, you still have to check your house to save yourself from the prohibition of chametz sha'avar alav ha-Pesach, chametz that went through Pesach owned by a Jew, that's prohibited to benefit from. In that case, says the Shulchan Aruch, lo yivarech, you should not make a bracha, which means any other bedika from the time of the bedika onwards, namely from our perspective, Thursday night, April 10th, and onwards, you do make a bracha, even if you do it during the day. But my question today is a simple one. How come we do it 2 nights in advance? How come we don't do the bedika on Friday night? It would have been a very interesting idea. We'd make kiddush, we'd have a meal, and then we do a bedikat chametz. Or opposite, we do the bedikat chametz before we eat, as we should every year. Why is it that we do it 2 nights in advance? So the Beit Yosef gives the answer, and I'll quote it from the Shulchan Aruch Harav, Rav Shneur Zalman Miladi, who says very simply, the reason you cannot do the bedika on Friday night is Asur letaltel et haner. You're not allowed to on Shabbos carry a candle from one place to another because it may get extinguished. That leads to a rabbinic prohibition of even picking it up, not moving it, simply because once you can't move it, it becomes muktzeh. And therefore, because it becomes muktzeh, basically the candle is stationary, you can't use it, and you can't do a proper check without a candle or a flashlight. But the Lechem-Mishneh, one of the greatest rabbis who wrote an encyclopedia on the Torah, in his amazing work, quotes the Avnei Shoam, who I never heard of, like many of the great rabbis he quotes in his work, who asks, why not? After all, asay doche lo ta'asay. Throughout the Torah, we have a rule that a positive commandment that comes to cahoots with a negative commandment, the positive commandment overrides the negative commandment. For example, a Kohen who goes to work in the temple has to wear the priestly garments. If one of them has shatnez, which you're not allowed to wear, prohibition, but he's obligated to work in the temple with these clothing, the halacha is you put on the clothing because asay doche lo ta'aseh. So how come we can't say the mitzvah aseh of tashbitu from the Torah, get rid of the chametz, or if it's not the Torah prohibition, we'll take care of that in some other way. We're talking about the positive commandment to do a check, which is a rabbinic commandment that the rabbis told us to do. How come that doesn't override the prohibition of muktzeh, of carrying around the candle? This is the question of the Avnei Shoham. As a matter of fact, in another variation, the Magen Avraham quotes the Shlah, who comes along and says, you know what? Let's not go so far. Let's do what many Jews do every Shabbos. Let's use a non-Jew. Every Jew will hire a non-Jew. They'll make a lot of money. On the night before Pesach, which will be Friday night, they'll carry the candle. So if it gets extinguished, they extinguished it. How come we can't even, at the very least, allow a non-Jew to help us do this mitzvah? Why do we do it 2 nights in advance? Either we'll use a non-Jew, or aseh doche lo ta'aseh, we'll carry the candle ourselves. 4 answers to this question. The Lechem-Mishneh comes along and says that at the end of the day, when you go ahead and say aseh doche lo ta'aseh, that's only if you have no breira. Namely, the Kohen has to wear those garments. There's no other garments. That's the way God said to make him with shatnez. But if there's a way to do it in a permissible way, then we don't invoke that law. And here we do have a way. Instead of doing it Friday night, we'll do it Thursday night. After all, you can check for chametz 30 days before Pesach. You're obligated to, as a matter of fact. And therefore, there's no reason to invoke this rule. That's answer number 1. Answer number 2 is, aseh doche lo ta'aseh is only if, at the very moment that you're doing the positive commandment, you're fulfilling it at that moment. In this case, we're not. We're just checking for chametz. There's going to be a long way till we get rid of it. Only the next day we're going to burn it. Some of it's going to be left over for Shabbos, perhaps, to use. And ultimately, we'll flush it down the toilet on Shabbos morning or throw it in the garbage after throwing some bleach on it. Whatever it might be, we're not mekayem the mitzvah aseh at that very moment. We're not fulfilling the obligation, the mitzvah, and therefore you cannot invoke aseh doche lo ta'aseh, a positive commandment, going ahead and taking away a negative commandment. Answer number 3. The Maharam Lublin and the Ran said it should have. As a matter of fact, it should have worked. But the Chachamim wanted to make a chizuk l'divreihem. They said muktzeh is so important, we're going to strengthen it by saying that this law, aseh doche lo ta'aseh, will not apply to it. And finally, answer number 4 is of the Lechem-Mishneh himself. He comes along and says that aseh doche lo ta'aseh does not apply in a very chamor lo ta'aseh, a very stringent one. And extinguishing on Shabbos is high up there. If you extinguish on Shabbos, you're chayav karet, and worse. And therefore, it wouldn't work. So for these 4 reasons, at the end of the day, we do the Bedikat. Not the night before, but 2 nights before. We do not invoke aseh doche lo ta'aseh, and we do not use a non-Jew. And regarding that non-Jew issue, I just want to say that I think this is one of the many proofs that indeed the rule in your homes should be, we do not use non-Jews to do things on Shabbos for us that we can't do. We only use them in cases of great need, and there's rules and regulations when. Point positive. Our rabbi said, do the Bedikat 2 nights in advance, and do not use a non-Jew, simply because it's not that permissible. In this very unique year, and that's the burning of the chametz. On a regular year, we burn the chametz the night after we do the check, and we have to get it done an hour before chatzot, an hour before midday, and ultimately that is the halacha on a regular Erev Pesach. This year, Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, so burning chametz on Shabbos is, of course, not an option. We don't light a fire on Shabbos. So what do? Obviously, the answer is going to be we're going to burn it a day early. However, the question is the timing. So the Mordechai, who was the chavruta of the Rosh, hinhig Rashi, an old minhag from Rashi, kishachal yudalid liot b'Shabbat, when indeed the 14th is on Shabbos like this year, lisrof chametz b'yud gimel, b'yom shishi, you burn it on Friday, a day early, be'erev Shabbat, kodem chatzot, before midday. Why before midday? Essentially, chametz is allowed all day. You're allowed to eat it Friday night. So why do you have to burn it before midday? It's a very funny thing. You're going to burn the chametz and then you're going to eat it. Why? Gzera shema yishel shana ba'ala achar chatzot v'tzarich esorfo shelo yachlif b'shar hashanim. He basically says that next year you're going to remember, oh, this is what I do. On Erev Pesach, I'm going to burn the chametz in the afternoon. But on a regular Erev Pesach, that's not an option. By midday, all bets are off. So in order for you not to make that mistake, we essentially tell you, even this year, Friday, burn the chametz before midday. And that's exactly the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins. He, of course, can't say it's a halacha, but he says, Tov, liva'er be'erev Shabbat. It's a good idea to burn it on Friday. Call them chatzot before midday, kedei shelo yavo l'ta'ut b'shar hashanim. However, the question is as follows. On a regular year, there's a rabbinic enactment so that we don't get to midday, that they pushed it back a little bit, and they said an hour before midday is the time that you have to have the chametz burnt by. Here, where essentially it's a huge chumrah, after all, you're allowed to eat chametz all Friday, do you have to be as careful and indeed do it an hour before midday or not? Comes the Mishnah Bura and says, Kodem chatzot lav dafka. As the Mishnah Bura does many times in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, he says he doesn't really mean that. When he says Kodem chatzot lav dafka, v'ratzal omar b'tchilat sha'a shishit kemo shar hashanim. So ultimately on Friday, you act like as if it's Erev Pesach, an hour before midday. That's the time that the chametz has to be burned, and the Chaye Adam actually concurs. He says, Umevaharin b'yom vav b'sha'a hey, not midday, which is the 6th hour, but rather the 5th hour, an hour before. You go ahead and burn the chametz, kemo bechol Erev Pesach, as if it's the eve of Pesach. But the Maharsham Shvadron disagrees. He says, the Shulchan Aruch says, chatzot, only on a year where it's a deoraita after the 6th hour to own chametz do we push it back an hour. But this year, there's no such thing. And therefore, he says, there's no reason to make a gzeira ligzeira. And therefore, when the Shulchan Aruch says chatzot, he means midday. He doesn't mean an hour before midday. And therefore, I've instructed everyone that asked me, try to burn the chametz before the 5th hour, and essentially get it done by midday. In other words, on the one hand, it's not an Erev Pesach, but on the other hand, in order not to make that mistake next year, I said to everyone, act as if it's Erev Pesach, but if you're very pressed for time or there's some circumstance, obviously you can do it till midday. That's the Pashut Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, and that seems to be, indeed, what is is once we burn our chametz on a normal year, we don't need it anymore. We get rid of it. We say bitul chametz, etc. That's not the protocol this year. Can we eat chametz after we burn it? And the answer, of course, is yes. The Shulchan Aruch paskins umevaharim akol ifnei Shabbat. You try to get rid as much as possible before Shabbos. Umishayrin mazon shtei Seudah l'tzarech Shabbat. But you can leave chametz food for Shabbos itself. We'll get to that later in this series. But quite frankly, it's a funny thing this year. You're going to burn the chametz as if it's Erev Pesach, and then you're going to eat the chametz on Friday night, Shabbos morning, up until the time you can't. And therefore, Friday afternoon, Friday evening, Shabbos morning, up until that time, you're allowed to eat chametz. And that's what the Biur Halacha says. Indeed, he said, we're going to burn our chametz so early on Friday. You don't have to just leave the 2 meals for Shabbos. You can leave even more than that. But you should know that the Piskei Tshuvos brings, as he always does, all these opinions, mainly Hasidic, that come and say, well, there are minhagim from different Hasidic rabbis that say once you burn the chametz, you shouldn't leave any chametz over. And therefore, outside of the Lechem-Mishneh issue, you shouldn't have any chametz Friday afternoon. Now, that might be a good idea practically, and indeed that's what I advise people, but halachically, it seems very strange. But I will quote his words. He does say that when the Shulchan Aruch says you leave the 2 meals for Shabbos, that's all you leave. But from Friday afternoon, outside of those 2 meals for Shabbos, you shouldn't be eating chametz. Why? For the same reason again. You shouldn't make the mistake next year and eat chametz on Erev Pesach afternoon. So, at the end of the day, to sum up, can you leave chametz over and eat it Friday afternoon, Friday evening, Shabbos morning? It might not be a practical idea to bring it into the house, but halachically the Biur Halacha says no problem. The Piskei Tshuvos does bring different opinions that say, just like we don't want to make a mistake with the burning, we don't want to make a mistake with the eating. But at the end of the day, he has to concur, and he says, Minhag ha'olam lo lachshoch lechumra zo va'ochlim chametz be'erev Shabbat kol hayom. And that is the Isur Melacha of Erev Pesach. On a regular Erev Pesach after midday, there is an Isur Melacha. What the parameters of that are is for another year. But let's see if it even exists this year, because quite frankly, on Erev Pesach, we will all be in an Isur Melacha. And that is, of course, it will be Shabbos. So it goes without saying, we won't be doing any Melacha. But on Friday, after we burn the Chametz and whatnot, in the afternoon, is there an Isur Melacha or not? This goes back to why there's an Isur Melacha on a regular Erev Pesach. So, the Mishnah in Psachim says that the Isur Melacha on Erev Pesach before midday is dependent upon minhag. Namely, if you live in a community that has this Isur Melacha, you must do it, and if not, not. But after midday, everybody has Isur Melacha, a prohibition of Melacha, on the eve of Pesach following midday. Why? Says Rashi, you shouldn't be too, wrangled up in work. You'll forget to burn the chametz, pesach, and to bring the korban pesach, and to have matzahs for the night. In other words, the Isur Melacha is in place so that you get all the Seder preparations done on time, so that you can start the Seder, as Rashi says, right away, because we want the kids to be awake. But the Yerushalmi has a totally different perspective on this. There is a halacha that while your korban is being sacrificed in the Beis HaMikdash, you don't do melacha. Once upon a time, no one really ate the korban pesach alone. We had minuyim, namely, we all got on to a specific korban pesach. One person went to the Beis HaMikdash to sacrifice it for us, and maybe we were waiting back in Yerushalayim in some home until it was sacrificed in order to start the Seder when it gets dark. So, quite frankly, says the Gemara, while the korban pesach is being sacrificed, you do not do malacha. And even though today there's no korban pesach, that stayed in place. Well, says the Biur Halacha, that's the nafkamina. Exactly, this year, on the one hand, Korban Pesach is Doche Shabbos, so it would be brought on Shabbos, even though it's Shabbos. On the other hand, all the preparations for the Seder are going to be done on Friday, because on Shabbos, we're not allowed to do Malacha. So indeed, says the Biur Halacha, that if indeed the reason is that it's because of the Korban Pesach, therefore, Imchal B'motzei Shabbat, if Pesach comes out on Saturday night, Mutar B'melacha mi'ikar adin, Adam Mincha, you're allowed to do malacha like every Erev Shabbos till the time of Mincha Kitana. Because the Korban Pesach is only going to be brought tomorrow. But, says the Biur Halacha, if Rashi is correct, that everything should be ready on time, then it makes sense, because the fitam zeh, afilu keshechal Pesach b'motzei Shabbos, even if Pesach comes out on Saturday night, gam ken yesh lizaher shelo l'sot melacha michatzel sharei tarud b'biur chemtzo v'tikun hamatzah l'tzorach machar. At the end of the day, all the preparations we usually do on Erev Pesach will happen a day early on Friday, and therefore you should have this Isur Melacha in place on Friday. At the end of the day, the Biur Halacha Paskins, or a Poskim Tovsim, Tama Yerushalmi. Most of the Poskim Paskin like the Yerushalmi. It's Korban Pesach dependent, not practically dependent on our preparations for Pesach, and therefore, if Sharda Ein Lachmir, and therefore you shouldn't be Machmir. Because he quotes it in the name of the Maharil, I went to the Maharil, and indeed the Maharil says explicitly that at the end of the day, you do not need to be Machmir, even if you want to. But if you want to be machmir, you should machmir la'atzmo, which is a very cardinal rule when it comes to chumras in general. If you have a chumrah, keep it to yourself. Machmir is famir alein, as we say in Yiddish, for me alone. And indeed, if you want to be machmir to have an Isur Melacha on Erev Pesach, that's not Erev Pesach, namely Erev Pesach, then it should be your own personal chumrah, but should not be one for everyone else. If you want to do like a low plug, as we did with the burning of the chametz, having it before midday, that's your business. But in terms of Isur Melacha, it's a regular Friday, up until Mincha Ktana, you can do Melacha. Now this machlokes will have one nafkamina, and that is the Yisei V'hi Noam the week before. It's a full week of work or not. If indeed Erev Pesach was Friday, it's a machlokas because there is that Isur Melacha from Chatzot and on. But this year, since Mi'ikar Hadin, there is no Isur Melacha, then everybody would agree that indeed you say V'yi Noam on the Saturday night prior to the Shabbos before Pesach. Event in this unique year of Erev Pesach Shechal Lihiyot b'Shabbat, and we're on Friday, the day before Erev Pesach. And I'd like to now give a few practical tips for that particular Friday. So, number one, it's almost impossible to eat chametz and clean the dishes on Shabbos. Though you can clean the dishes Friday night in some sink at home that's not kosher for Pesach, and then eat from them Shabbos morning before the time of not eating chametz Shabbos morning. Those dishes are going to be a problem to wash, because the only reason you're going to wash them is not because you're going to use them on Shabbos, but rather use them 8 days later after Pesach. And therefore, my advice is, A, use disposables for both Friday night and Shabbos morning, especially if you're going to eat chametz, namely, you're going to eat the Lechem-Mishneh, being rolls or pitot. Obviously, use nice disposables, friendly to the environment disposables, but disposables does solve a lot of problems. Idea number 2. Everything should be kosher for Pesach before Shabbos. Obviously, we can't kosher on Shabbos. That would be metaken, and therefore, the house has to be obviously clean for Pesach, and the kitchen should be kosher for Pesach before Shabbos begins. This would lead to tip number 3, and that is that I advise that all the food we eat on Shabbos should be kosher for Pesach, with the exception of 2 things. Number 1, what you use for Lechem-Mishneh, we'll get to that. And number 2, you can eat kitniot, you can eat legumes, you can eat rice, you can eat corn. There's no problem whatsoever, in my opinion, to use your Pesach dishes and your Pesach pots because they're 100% kosher for Pesach. It's just an Ashkenazic minhag not to eat from them. And therefore, with a proper kashrus for Pesach for Sfaradim, you can obviously eat them Friday night, Shabbos morning, up until the time that you can't eat chametz. Tip number 3, I would advise that everything you need for the Seder should be ready Friday as much as possible. What does that include? That includes roasting the zeroah, the shake bone, roasting the egg that you put on the Seder plate, checking the lettuce that you use for maror for bugs, preparing the salt water, and having all the ingredients of the charoset ready so you can mix them Motzei Shabbos. If indeed you think that mixing them Friday will take away the taste, you're allowed to mix them on Yontiv, meaning Saturday night. The Isser of Lush does not apply on Yontiv if you think the taste will not be as good, but the ingredients should be better. Why do I say all of this? For 2 reasons. Number 1, so that the Seder can start right away. It's already going to be late because of Motzei Shabbos. And number 2, if you didn't do it, then you could roast the shake bone on Motzei Shabbos as well as the hard-boiled egg, but you must eat them on Yontiv. If you don't eat them, you're not allowed to roast them. So you don't eat them at the Seder, that's the Ashkenazic minhag, but you definitely have to eat them on Sunday before the day is over, and I'm not so sure you're going to remember to do that. The same thing is with other things, like the salt water. For those living in Israel, if you need to take trumot and masrot from your fruits and vegetables, make sure to do it on Friday. It's forbidden to do on Shabbos as well as on Yontiv. Finally, 2 more points. If you use wax candles to light candles, make sure you melt them in for Saturday night, or in Chutz La'aretz for Saturday night and Sunday night, because it's usur to melt them on Yontiv. It would be an isser of mimachik. So if you use wax candles, make sure that you melt them in before Shabbos. If you use neironim, if you don't know what that is, don't worry. Neironim have a little metal thing on the bottom, and in order to reuse them, you have to take out that metal thing. That metal thing is muktzeh, and therefore it would be impossible to take it out. And therefore, if you do use neironim, prepare a little cup with 2 neironim or whatever candles that you light, so that you can very simply take off the glass that you used for Shabbos, Saturday night, put on the new glasses with the Neironim in them. Same thing, obviously, in Chutz La'aretz for Sunday night. Finally, last but not least, there's two more things that you need to do. One, set your Shabbos clocks so that it would indeed be on Saturday night as well. If it's impossible or you don't want to waste electricity, so you can set it Friday night till, say, 11 o'clock at night, whenever you end your meal, and then on Saturday night, lengthen that existing situation from 11 to 2 o'clock in the morning whenever you finish your Seder. That's not a problem. But don't forget to light a yahrzeit candle. If you want to light candles Saturday night, you need at least a 48-hour candle to light from Friday all the way through Saturday night and Sunday. I would advise to use a 72-hour candle. In any case, obviously for Chutz La'aretz, but even in Israel, sometimes that 48-hour candle doesn't last exactly 48 hours. So those are the practical tips that I would advise to do on Friday before Shabbos. We get into Shabbos, our house is kosher for Pesach, the ingredients for the Seder are ready, and ultimately we get to the next challenge, which is going to be, what do we use for the Lechem-Mishneh, the double loaf, on Shabbos?
שבשפלנו זכר לנו ויפרקנו מצרנו שבשפלנו זכר לנו ויפרקנו מצרנו שבשפלנו זכר לנו ויפרקנו מצרנו.
We're on to event number 7, and that is, what are we going to use for Lechem-Mishneh Friday night, Shabbos morning, and maybe even at Shlishit? We have an obligation on Shabbos to eat meals with bread, at least 2 out of the 3. What should we use? The simplest answer would be, let's use matzah. The house is already kosher for Pesach, though a day early. Let's use matzah. Here's the problem. There's a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, Ha'ochel matzah be'erev Pesach, whoever eats matzah on the eve of Pesach, keba al arusato beveit chamiv. It's like someone that berothed a woman, said Hareat Mekudeshetli, gave her a ring, and then without Shever brachas and a ketubah, began to live with her. Obviously, that's not halachically okay. We wait till the Seder night, and then, after saying at least 7 brachot, as it is the case with a chatan and a kala, so too, we say 7 brachot at the Seder, and eventually eat the matzah. That being the case, it seems like, if there's a Yerushalmi, matzah is out of the question. But not so simple. The Tosfot Reed says that with the greatest respect, this is a Yerushalmi. The Bavli said explicitly at the beginning of the 10th perek of Masechet Pesachim that on Erev Pesach, Somuch lemincha, half an hour before Mincha Ketana, Lo yochal adam ad shetechshach. A person shouldn't eat anything grain-based until it gets dark. Quite frankly, since we're dealing with what we shouldn't eat, then the Mishnah should have said something about, and you also can't eat matzah from the morning. Since it didn't, since the Gemara didn't, basically the Tosfot Reed says there's no problem to eat matzah on the eve of Pesach, and ultimately, probably at his house, that's what he did. But the Rob Ruvam Shel HaPoskim, the majority of the Poskim, disagree and have poskin this lahalacha. This is the psak of the Tosfot. The Tosfot indeed asks about that famous Mishnah, Arvei Psachim, Samuch lemincha, lo yochal adam ad shetechshach, asks the Tosfot, V'im tomar ma lo yochal, what exactly can he eat? Matzah, if we're talking about matzah, hafilu kodem nami asur. Matzah is forbidden earlier than in samuch lemincha, a half an hour before mincha ketana. Kedam rinan by Yerushalmi, like the Yerushalmi says. This is also the psak of the Rambam that says explicitly asru chachamim lechol matzah be'erev Pesach. And this is the psak of the Ramah saying that you're not allowed to eat matzah the entire day before Pesach. So the bottom line is, we do not eat matzah on the eve of Pesach. The only question is, when does the eve of Pesach start for this prohibition? The Ramban says it starts from the evening, so even Friday night is out. The Igrod Moshe of Moshe Feinstein actually says something very, very interesting. He says that this year it starts from Friday night, since we got rid of all our chametz basically before Shabbos. This particular year, it starts from the evening. However, the Ramah says that you're not allowed to eat it from the morning. That is the way the Mishnah Brura understands him. And the Baal Amar has an interesting take, and he says it's later. It's from Chatzot, from the time you bring the Korban Pesach, that's the time that you can eat matzah. Namely, for the Baal Hamor, it's no problem to eat matzah Friday night or Shabbos morning. The only problem we'll have is Shlishit. But, as you could see, at least 3 out of the 4 that I quoted, namely the Ramban, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and the Ramah says you can't eat matzah for the 2 meals. The Ramah would say at least not for the meal in the morning. The Rav Moshe and the Ramban would say even from the evening. That being the case, what are we going to use for Lechem-Mishneh? There were 2 little suggestions that were made that maybe we could use matzah after all. One was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Mishnah Berurah says that if you take matzah and you cook it, as we do with knedalach, then it's okay to use, and to use it up until the 9th hour of the day. Ovadia Yosef suggested that the only matzah you can use is matzah that's kosher for the Seder, namely matzah that's baked. So what should you do? You should take the baked matzah, put it into the chicken soup pot for at least 2 minutes while it's boiling, and then you don't have what we call baked matzah, you have cooked matzah, which you can't use for the Seder, and anything you can use for the Seder would be okay to use the Shabbos before, and that's what you should make a motzi on Friday night, Shabbos morning, even at Shlishit, up until the what's called the 9th hour of the day. Not everyone agreed with this. At the end of the day, it is matzah. At the end of the day, it looks like matzah, so it was cooked for only 2 minutes, and at the end of the day, not many agreed with him. The Sharat Tziyun brings that the Chayei Adam did actually say this, but he says that the Magen Avraham says this is not our minhag, and the Gra understands in the Rambam that it is still matzah per the prohibition of eating it on Erev Pesach. And finally, there was another suggestion made by Rav Zolti, who was the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. He says the whole problem of eating matzah is that you're eating matzah that's kosher for the Seder. So he had a great suggestion. Let's eat matzah and make it not kosher for the Seder. Namely, we'll bake matzah and we'll say it's not l'shem matzat mitzvah. It is not for the sake of the Seder, and that should be the matzah we eat for Shabbos. Rav Ovadia Yosef contemplated it and said it might be okay b'sha'at adchak if you have no choice. Many didn't accept this point of view for a number of reasons. Number 1, it goes to the reason why we can't eat matzah on the Erev Pesach. The Rokeach says it's because it says ba'erev tochlu matzah, don't eat matzah at night, and it's not night yet. If that was the case, then maybe you can't even eat it during the day, but that's only matzah that you eat at night for the mitzvah. This is matzah that was baked not for the mitzvah. However, the Rambam says for a different reason. Kedei sheyeh heker la'achilata ba'erev. It should be noticeable that you're eating it at night for the mitzvah. That's the case, something that looks like matzah, smells like matzah, and actually tastes like matzah, obviously would not be a good idea to eat because the heker part would be decayed. And therefore, it wouldn't work according to that reason. And for sure, it wouldn't work according to the Meiri. The Meiri says that the reason that you can't eat matzah on the eve of Pesach is achilat matzah b'chol hayom mechu'ara davar. It's disgusting. Shemishum te'avon emra. It's in order to arouse your tummy, you arouse your taste towards the evening of eating matzah. So if you taste matzah during the day, even if it was baked shalol l'shem mitzvah, at the end of the day, you won't have that same appetite towards the evening. And even Rav Ovadia Yosef concedes that at the end of the day, if it tastes like matzah, even if it wasn't baked l'shem mitzvah, you can't eat it on Erev Pesach. There was another reason why it wasn't accepted. Maybe for the Seder it's good enough to have shmura matzah that we guard it from chametz. You didn't need to bake it l'shem mitzvah. That would be exactly Rabbi Zolti's matzahs, and therefore it wouldn't help. So at the end of the day, the matzah idea might be okay Friday night, according to the Baal Hamor, the Rosh, the Meiri. It would also be okay Shabbos morning up until the 6th hour of the day, up until midday. But according to the Ramah, it would not be okay from the morning, and according to the Ramban and Rav Moshe Feinstein, it wouldn't be even okay Friday night. So the matzah option seems to be out, and therefore we have to look for other ways of eating Lechem-Mishneh, God willing, this Shabbos. You're allowed to eat bread Friday night. You're allowed to eat bread Shabbos morning until the time you can't eat bread on an eve of Pesach. And therefore, indeed, the Mishnah Berurah says, Nahagu b'kama mekomot b'medinatenu, sha'achar atfilah ochlim ma'achalim karim shel chametz. Indeed, the Mishnah Berurah says that many people, after davening, up until the time you can't, eat cold chametz. They don't warm it up because the house is kosher for Pesach, but they eat cold chametz. So it seems like it's obviously an option. However, even though it's an option, you have to be careful about three things. Number one, as I mentioned, you have to finish it by the time that chametz is forbidden on Shabbos morning, which means you have to get up pretty early. And ultimately, if that's the case, then obviously davening will be earlier, and the second meal of Shabbos with washing, Kiddush, will be earlier. Number two, you have to make sure, obviously, not to warm them up and not to put them anywhere near the Pesach food, because if you do, you got a very big problem. If you warm them up on your plata, on your hot plate, on your blech, you have a huge problem because you cannot kasher on Shabbos, and you have chametz probably stuck to it. And indeed, the Shulchan Aruch paskins regarding any Shabbos, that you're allowed to go ahead and wash dishes, but after Shalosh Shudas you can't. Why? Because the bottom line is, there's no reason for it and there's no use for it. Thus, says the Shulchan Aruch regarding this particular Shabbos, En mebashlim daisa v'chayotze bezeh, you don't make farina and other things like it, meaning in a pot. You don't make toast, namely you don't make your challah hot. And indeed the Ramah says, and if indeed you did so, and there's no way to wash it properly because you can't use a sponge at Shabbos, you can't put it in the dishwasher at Shabbos, you should try to do what you can, like put a little bleach on it, or try to take it off quite carefully with that Shabbos brush, but it's going to be a very big problem. And therefore the Mishnah Berurah says that the bottom line is that anything that sticks to a pot or a pan or a plate, you should not use this particular Shabbos coming up, because, and I quote his lovely words, and he says it explicitly, because you don't need it that day, you're not allowed to wash it. It's called hachana mikodesh l'chol. And therefore, the bottom line is, if you want to use bread, what you better do is go ahead, make sure it's not warmed up anywhere near the kitchen, and obviously eat it, a bread that doesn't make a lot of crumbs. My suggestion, pitot. But even if you do so, you don't want to eat it on the Pesach dishes, so therefore you should make hamotzi away from the table, but in sight of your table, because, not because of Hilchos Pesach, not because of Hilchos Shabbos, but because of Hilchos Brachos. In Hilchos Brachos, we have a law that says that if you're Moshech Yado min hapat, if you go ahead and you no longer need the bread, maybe you have to make brachos on everything else at the meal. We usually think that once you make hamotzi, there's no need for other brachot, but that's only if the bread's on the table and you can eat it. In this case, you're going to make hamotzi away from the table, and you're not going to touch the bread while you eat your kosher for Pesach Friday night and Shabbos morning meal. So maybe it's a problem of Moshech Yado min hapat. If it is, as the Shulchan Aruch says, we would have to make brachot on everything else we eat at the meal. A shahakol before we eat the chicken, a borei pri adama before we eat the potatoes. Is that indeed the case if we're going to eat bread away from the table and not at the table? The truth of the matter is, I don't think so. Though the Biur Halacha does bring a point of view that says it is a problem, it seems to me that it's not such a big problem, and that is because of a combination of two things. Number one, the Biur Halacha brings another point of view that you need akirat hashulchan. You need to take the table away physically to be in a status of moshech yado min hapat. Namely, you're no longer going to touch that bread at all. That's not the case. We leave the table in place. And number two, the Rashba. The Rashba, quoted by the Biur Halacha, says that at the end of the day, that law only applies for dessert, but things that are part of the meal, such as meat, potatoes, and other things, then that law would not apply to. However, just to be machmir on this question, if you're going to use bread, my advice is that you eat the bread, make hamotzi in sight of the table, but away from the table, and the last bite you eat at the table. This way, there's not a problem because you did eat bread at the table. You have to say you're moshech yado min hapat. You're staying away from the bread if you actually ate it at the table, albeit the last piece, not every piece of bread. Ad kan, the bread option for Lechem-Mishneh, which will only work Friday night or Shabbos morning. And we're up to what's called the egg matzah option. So let's take a step back and understand why Ashkenazim don't eat egg matzah on Pesach. The Gemara in Pesachim says, "Mei peirot einam machmitzin." If you didn't mix into the matzah water, but you mix in fruit juices as egg matzah is made, then it does not become chametz. That's the simple understanding of the Gemara. That's the way the Tosfot understood the Gemara. That's the way the Rambam understood the Gemara, and that's why the Shulchan Aruch says that Sfardim can, of course, eat egg matzah. But Rashi says, no, that's not what the Gemara means. What the Gemara means is that at the end of the day, mimaheret lahachmitz, that it's not like flour and water, which takes 18 minutes. It actually becomes chametz even sooner than the 18 minutes. Oh my gosh, that's what the Ravid also says on the Rambam, that ultimately it becomes chametz earlier. From this perspective, the Ramah basically says that he's right, but our minhag is to be machmir for Rashi, except for the famous cholim and skenim. And therefore, if you ever saw egg matzah's hechsher, you'll see that it says kasher lepesach, and then in small little writing it says ayin Ramah. I don't know how many people looked up the Ramah, so I'm telling you the Ramah now. The Ramah says that b'sha'at hatchak litzorchei chole uzakein hatzarich lezeh, it's okay. All that is true on Pesach, but now we're talking about the day before Pesach. It seems like it would be the best solution. On the one hand, it's not chametz. On the other hand, it's made out of grain, and therefore we could use it for our Lechem-Mishneh. And indeed, many, I repeat, many have said this is a great idea. The Meiri says, Shema b'matzah shira shein b'torat matzah. Indeed, use this egg matzah because it's not considered matzah that you're not allowed to eat on Erev Pesach, but it's also not considered chametz. Also dealing with the question of what exactly can't we eat samach lemincha after the 9th halachic hour on Erev Pesach, says what's there left to eat? You can't eat matzah on Erev Pesach, you can't eat bread from the morning, and he says it must be you can't eat egg matzah, implying that egg matzah is okay on Erev Pesach, and that is the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. Indeed, Rav Moshe Feinstein advises everyone, get rid of all your chametz on Friday, come into Shabbos with no chametz, and only use egg matzah for Shabbos, because on the one hand, you can eat it at the table, it's not chametz, on the other hand, it's not matzah, and it seems to be the best possible solution. However, some people don't eat it for a number of reasons. And number one, the Sharat Tziyun, which is the super parish of the Mishnah Berurah on himself, basically says that according to the Gra, maybe according to the Rambam, this is considered matzah enough to be forbidden on the eve of Pesach, and therefore it wouldn't help us on Shabbos. Number two, the Maharal says that when there's pressing circumstances and you don't have shmura matzah, then you can use egg matzah, even at the Seder, to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder. If that's the case, anything that you could use at the Seder will be forbidden the day before, namely on Shabbos. And number three, it seems like the Rambam's definition for matzah ashira is matzah that was mixed with yayin, dvash, shemen, v'chalav. Wine, honey, oil, or milk, but not the way they make egg matzahs today, which is with apple juice or other fruit juice. And the bottom line is, if that's the case, it's not considered egg matzah, it's considered regular matzah, and you can't eat it on Pesach. Obviously, if you make egg matzah with grape juice or with wine, then it would be fine, but you have to look for that particular brand. Having said that, this Maharal, this Sharat Tziyun, this understanding in the Rambam are few and far between. It seems like many Gdolei HaPoskim, Meiri, Tosfot, Rav Moshe Feinstein, have advised the egg matzah idea. However, the question is, till when can we use it on Erev Pesach? The Noda Yehuda basically says that you could use matzah ashira until the time you can't eat grain-based products on the eve of Pesach, which is the 9th halachic hour of the day, what's called samuch lemincha. It also seems to be the idea of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, "V'kodem sha'a asirit mutar lechol matzah ashira," and it seems there that the Ramah doesn't disagree. He just says about matzah sheyotzim ba b'layla asurim lechol kol yom ha'ba'asar. But regular matzah you can't eat on Erev Pesach. But he doesn't dispute the fact that you can use matzah ashira all day. That being the case, we can use it for Shlishit as well, because we'll eat Shlishit before the 9th hour of the day. In Israel, that comes out to about 10 to 4. And ultimately, we'll be able to have 3 meals of Shabbos with egg matzah without a problem. And indeed, the Shulchan Aruch advises this. He says regarding Shlishit, and I quote his words, the Seudah Shlishit is manach har mincha, since you can't eat Shlishit until mincha gedola time, a half an hour after midday. Va'az ein la'asotah lo b'matzah v'lo b'chametz. Impossible to eat matzah because we didn't eat it from the morning or maybe the night before, and we can't use chametz because by that hour it's already forbidden. How are we going to do Shlishit? B'matzah ashira. So at the bottom line is, it seems like both the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah agree, but then comes the Ramah in a different place and says, "Ubemidinot elu she'en ochlim noagim lechol matzah ashira." Where we live, since we don't use matzah ashira during Pesach, then this would lend itself to mean that we don't use it on Erev Pesach, on the time you don't eat chametz. That being the case, Yekayem Seudah Shlishit b'minei perot u'basar v'dagim. We have no choice but to use opinion number 3 or opinion number 4 of how to fulfill Shlishit on any Shabbos. We can't use bread, no double loaf, so the only 2 opinions left are use meat and potatoes, or even fruit, and that would be the only way to eat Shlishit. So one Ramah seems to say that it's okay to use matzah ashira all day, up until samuch lemincha. But the other one seems to say it's off limits from the time that you can't eat chametz. So it's definitely a good solution for Friday night, Shabbos morning up until the chametz time, but once you reach the chametz time, it seems to be a contradiction in the Ramah. So Shulchan says that basically, according to the Ramah, you can use egg matzah till the 9th hour of the day. But what he meant when he said, "B'midinot ha'elu we don't usually have egg matzah," he meant that there is none in the stores, because you don't bake egg matzah if the Ashkenazim don't use it. As such, there's nothing available, just on a practical level. But if you live in a place where it is available, there's no problem to use it on Erev Pesach. In other words, if I can quote the words of the Ramah once again, since we don't usually eat matzah ashira, the Aruch HaShulchan would add in parentheses, not available in the stores, then at Shlishit you got no grain-based product. That's the way the Aruch HaShulchan explained it. However, the Chok Yaakov, which is a perush on the Shulchan Aruch, disagrees. And he ultimately says that even on Erev Pesach, from the time that chametz is forbidden, the Ramah agrees that you can't eat egg matzah. Why didn't he make this clear when the Shulchan Aruch says use it for Shlishit? Don't know. But basically the Ramah's opinion is we treat it like chametz, off limits from the time you can't eat chametz. The Noda Yehuda doesn't like the Ramah. He says, "Ani tamea ala Ramah," that ultimately said this. But according to the Ramah, at the end of the day, you're not allowed to eat egg matzah because we basically treat it as chametz. Bottom line is, it seems like we're machmir on this question, and therefore it's a great solution Friday night, a great solution Shabbos morning if you wake up early before the time you can't eat chametz. But after the time you can't eat chametz, it seems to be that according to the Ramah, we treat it like chametz, off limits. According to the Shulchan Aruch, it's good. We are up to event number 8, and that is the event that happens on Shabbos morning after we made Kiddush, ate a Lechem-Mishneh, which whatever mode you decided. We have to, of course, physically get rid of the chametz that's left over, if there's any left over, and also say Bitul Chametz. So let's start with the second, and then we'll get back for the first. Bitul Chametz basically is a verbal declaration that any chametz that I didn't find, that I didn't physically get rid of, I want it to be mivutal. Whatever that might mean, if it means I want to make it ownerless, if it means it for me like dust, if it means that it has no chashivut in my eyes, it has no importance in my eyes, it's very important to say it just to cover yourselves on a biblical level. So indeed, the Shulchan Aruch says that while we burn the chametz on Erev Shabbos, the Ramah points out, Uveyom HaShabbat yevatlenu. And obviously for a very simple reason, as the Mishnah Bura explains, Ve'ino tzarich levatel be'erev Shabbat b'sha'at bi'uro. You don't have to say Bitul Chametz on Friday, meaning a day early, when you burn it. Why? The sof sof yet tzarich levatel b'yom machar. Anyway, you're going to have to say Bitul Chametz again. Sharei chozer v'zocher b'pat she'mashe'er v'tzorech HaShabbat. If people are going to leave Chametz over for Friday night, Shabbos morning, they're going to have to say it again. So it's useless to say it on Friday. Therefore, we say it on Shabbos morning. So once again, on Shabbos morning, before the time that you can't own Chametz, which is an hour before midday, you're supposed to say the Bitul Chametz. And from this perspective, ultimately, we finish eating chametz 4 halachic hours into the day, and we get rid of the chametz and say bitul chametz 5 hours into the day. But even this is not without machlokas, as everything else is regarding Erev Pesach shechal liyot b'Shabbat. So the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim Daf Mem Tet Amud Aleph brings a machloket Tanaim between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim. Rabbi Meir says to get rid of all the chametz before Shabbos, and yet the Chachamim, the majority opinion, says no, on Shabbos. The Baal HaMaor, which many a times brings sensational points of view, on this particular level explains it very straightforward, and says the Baal HaMaor that according to Rabbi Meir, you have to get rid of the chametz before Shabbos, everything, meaning Shabbos morning there's nothing more left to do, and that's because, for a very simple reason. He says the only way to get rid of chametz is to burn it. You can't burn it on Shabbos, obviously. You won't light a fire on Shabbos, and therefore, by default, you have to get rid of it on Friday. But the majority opinion says there's other ways to get rid of the chametz. For example, mefarer v'zoreh laruach u'metil layam. You could basically make it into small little pieces and flush it down the toilet. You could make it into small little pieces and throw it out to the wind, or you can throw it into the ocean, whatever the methods that are actually permitted on Shabbos, and therefore there's no reason to get rid of it on Friday. You can leave your Lechem-Mishneh, let's say Bitul, for Friday night Shabbos morning, you finish eating it by the 4th halachic hour, and then you get rid of it by flushing it down the toilet, or by throwing it into the wind, or I'll add, put some bleach on it to make it inedible even for a dog's consumption, and throw it in the trash can better outside your house. So, seems very straightforward. This is their machlokes. However, when we get to the Rambam, we get a problem. Why? Because when the Rambam brings this, you would expect the Rambam to paskin like the majority opinion, and that is that on Shabbos morning, we get rid of the chametz, albeit not by burning it, but by the other methods. So indeed, the Rambam comes along and says, Chala bar saliyot b'Shabbat, when indeed the Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, you leave the chametz, say the pitot, to eat it up to 4 halachic hours into the day. And make sure to leave it in a bag away from all the Pesach stuff. And you're supposed to get rid of all the rest before Shabbos. And if there's anything left on Shabbos, then he doesn't say flush it down the toilet. He doesn't say to make it into small pieces and throw it out to the wind, like the majority opinion of the Chachamim, but rather he says, very surprisingly, you kofeh alav kli, you put something over it, umamotzei yom tov arishon, and Sunday night, or in Chutz La'aretz Monday night, you go ahead and you burn it. Seems very strange. He paskins like Rabbi Meir, which is a singular opinion that says you have to burn it, and not like the majority opinion saying there's different ways to get rid of the chametz that are permitted on Shabbos. And the question is, why? And indeed, the Ravid attacks the Rambam, as he many times does, that, quite frankly, at the end of the day, the majority opinion is that you can get rid of it on Shabbos. So why we burn it on Friday to fulfill that one opinion, we can also get rid of it on Shabbos by the other opinions. So why is it that the Rambam sort of made a chulent here? On the one hand, he says you can use chametz on Shabbos, but on the other hand, he says if there's anything left over, all bets are off. You have to put something on it so that after Yontiv, you'll burn it. It seems like he made a mishmash. Once again, The Rambam seems to have paskined like the minority opinion, saying burn it on Friday, and whatever's left over, there's nothing you can do. You have to burn it. Shabbos is off the table. Yontif is off the table. You have to wait till after Yontif to burn it. Why didn't he paskin like the majority opinion that says you can make it into small pieces and flush it down the toilet, for example? So indeed, the answer probably is the intertwining between Hilchos Shabbos and Pesach. The Mishneh Lamelech explains that indeed, according to the Rambam, on any Shabbos, it's a problem to take bread and to make it into small pieces for a very simple reason. And I quote his words, the Da'at Rambam, Asol lefarer halechem b'Shabbat, da'have tolada dedochein. Shabbos, there's one of the 39 that's forbidden, is called tochein, making something into very small pieces. According to the Rambam, that's forbidden. Others disagree and say that there's no tochein except for things that God made, not things that man made. And man made chametz. He made dough into bread. Actually, he made the dough itself. But the Rambam's opinion is that ultimately anything is off the table to make into small pieces on Shabbos, and therefore you got no choice. If there's any chametz left over, you got to put kli, some sort of a vessel on it, and only after Yontif burn it. That's the Mishneh Lamelech's approach in the Rambam. Rabbeinu Manoach, another parish on the Rambam, basically agrees, but he puts it down to a Derabanan level by saying Matzi Avi de Dami Litchina. It looks like tochen, even though it's not tochen. It assumes that Midoraisa needs to be something that's made, ultimately is like fruits or vegetables, not something that a human being made, namely something like bread. But the Minchas Chinuch has a totally different take on the Rambam's opinion. He says it has nothing to do with Shabbos, it has to do with Pesach. On Pesach, regarding the mitzvah of the Yom HaRishon, Tashpitu Seor Mibatechem, on the first day, which means Erev Pesach, you're supposed to get rid of the chametz. There's a very interesting chakira, as we call it in halachic Lomdisha language. Does that mean you just have to make sure there's no chametz in the house, or does that mean you have to actively buy chametz in order to get rid of it? And he says, according to the Rambam, yeah, you don't need to have chametz. You actually can get rid of it all. And that would fulfill the mitzvah of tashpitu, the mitzvah of getting rid of the chametz. Namely, the mitzvah of tashpitu means you have to make sure there's no chametz in the house. And if there isn't, you've done your work. You don't have to actively buy chametz, put out the 10 pieces in order to get rid of it. No. You have to make sure there's no chametz in the house. And therefore, that's the Rambam's plan for Shabbos. But if for some reason you do have chametz in the house, then get rid of it after Yontif, because in his opinion, you don't have to actively get rid of it on Erev Pesach. Those that disagree, which is the majority opinion, the Chachamim say, no, A, you need to have chametz in the house, and B, you have to actively get rid of it on Erev Pesach. And therefore, the only way to do it is to make it into small pieces and flush it down the toilet. So, to sum up, the next event is event number 8, which is Shabbos morning. Before the 5th halachic hour of the day, we have to A, get rid of our chametz in permissible ways, if there is any left over, which the majority opinion says, throw it down the toilet, put some bleach in it and throw it in the garbage, outside your property. And B, say Bitul chametz. Interestingly, the Rambam doesn't acknowledge that second point and basically says, just make sure you don't have chametz in the house. That's the best thing to do. But if you do have chametz in the house, put a kli on it and burn it after Yontif. In general, we don't paskin like the Rambam on this, and therefore, if there's any chametz left over on Shabbos, get rid of it. Throw it down the toilet, throw it in the garbage outside your property, or if there is no garbage outside your property, pour bleach on it, and then throw it out even within your property.
Shlishit is this year. So it's Erev Pesach. By a certain time, we can't eat chametz. By a certain time of the day, we can't eat any grain-based products. So what are we going to do with Shlishit? At least the second meal of Shabbos, we can make davening earlier and eat it. What are we going to do with Shlishit? Well, there's 4 solutions that are given. Going through them very quickly, if you look on the next page, you'll see that the Tashbetz Katan brings the minhag of the Maharam. That would ultimately do something crazy. He would go ahead and in the morning, get up very early, Vasikin, come home, make kiddush, wash, bench. Then he would take a break, play checkers, chess, once again, wash, eat, All this before the time that you're not allowed to eat chametz, before 10:30 in the morning, say. Nuts, right? And then in the afternoon, he would eat fruit because he wasn't sure if he was Mekayim Shlishit in the morning, because we all know that usually Shlishit is not in the morning. So in the afternoon, he ate fruit just in case he wasn't Mekayim Shlishit in the morning. As surprising as this solution is, the Mishnah Berurah says, oh, Gamkein, if you want to be a good person, it's a good idea also to do like the Maharam, Lechalek Seudah Shacharit Tat L'Shnayim. Indeed, in the morning before 10:30, already schnepping 2 meals. And of course, he says you better make a nice break between them, because if not, you're going to make brachos where you don't need them. Quoting the Gra that this is a good idea. Well, that's not the Mikubal idea. As a matter of fact, I didn't even suggest it on the many videos that I already put out for Erev Pesach Shechal Liyot B'Shabbat. Simply because the Tosfot calls this a bracha of levatala, even though it's the Bahag's idea. And ultimately, we paskin like the Shulchan Aruch every Shabbos. Says Shlishit achar mincha. That's the time for Shlishit. That's the way paskins in Simon Reish Tzadik Aleph. Only from the time of Mincha Gedola, half an hour halachically after midday, is the time you can eat Shlishit. So this idea of eating 2 meals in the morning is not a good idea. That's not the way we paskin regarding the time of Shlishit. So the Shulchan Aruch says, as after half an hour after midday, you can't eat matzah. It's Erev Pesach. You can't eat chametz. The time passed. So what are you supposed to do? Says the Shulchan Aruch. Very simple. Use egg matzah, matzah ashira. Solution number 2: use egg matzah. Cutoff time for egg matzah is the 9th halachic hour of the day, called samuch lemincha ketana. Half an hour before mincha ketana. That's the cutoff time for eating grain-based products. Fine. So that's no big deal. In the morning, we will wake up early, maybe yes, maybe not. Shulchan Aruch doesn't have a problem if you eat regular time, say 11 o'clock. And then at 1 o'clock, after you take a good break, you'll eat lunch with matzah shira and make sure to finish by, say, 10 to 4, whatever the time is of the 9th hour. Solution number 3 is the Mishnah Berurah. He says, I won't go so far as to allow maybe matzah shira, but guess what? On Erev Pesach, you can't eat baked matzah, but you can eat cooked matzah. So what should you eat for Shlishit? Eat a mizonos. What's a mizonos? That's not baked, cooked, knedulach, or anything else that's cooked. You can make a case, maybe fried would also be okay. But of course says up until that 9th hour of the day, samuch lemincha. Fine. So we have the wake up very early and eat 2 meals before 10:30 solution, the matzah ashira solution, and the cooked versus baked matzah solution. Comes along the Raman says, where by us, Ashkenazim, who consider matzah ashira chametz, at least not for regular people, it's chametz, not for cholim miskenim, then you can't eat matzah ashira past 10:30. So what should you do? You kayem Seudah Shlishit at the right time, either b'minei peirot, eat fruit, or basar v'dogim, eat lunch, but without grain, without bread. That's the Ashkenazic solution of the Rambam. So 3 solutions for Shlishit. Number 1, get up very early and schnepp in 2 meals before 10:30. Bracha she'eina tzricha, make sure to have a break between them, so you better break up very early. Number 2, matzah ashira, which according to the Shulchan Aruch is kosher on Pesach too, and you can eat it up till the 9th hour of the day. Number 3, the Mishnah Berurah solution, cooked matzah. Regular matzah, but cooked, not baked, which you're allowed to eat on Erev Pesach, like knedulach. That should be on your Shlishit table, mizonos. The 4th solution is the Ramah saying, eat your lunch, but without bread, meat, potatoes, chicken, whatever you eat for lunch, chulent, without the beans and without the barley, but no choice. Comes along the Magen Avraham and throws out a solution from left field. That's why I put it in green. Uva shla, the shla of Horbitz HaKadosh says, you don't call him HaKadosh for nothing. he quotes the Shla, because this is a crazy idea. V'shem HaZohar, in the name of the Zohar, written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Sherashbi Hayal Sek B'Torah B'Mkom Seudah Shlishit. Indeed, the Zohar says explicitly, when Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, I quote the words, Adechia Seudah de Malka, Seudah Shlishit, known as Seudah de Malka, right? Atinu Seudata de Mehim Menuta, whoever says that knows that it's referred to as Seudah de Malka. Nekame Seudata de Pischa, because of Pesach. In other words, on this Shabbos of Erev Pesach Shechal Liyot B'Shabbat, there's no Shalashudas. No Shalashudas. Instead, learn Torah.
Everyone, we are up to the final event for this special Erev Pesach Shechal Liyot B'Shabbat. So now we get to the end of Shabbos and the transition into Yontiv. In order for that transition to happen, you have to wait till Shabbos is over. So whenever Shabbos is over, that's when you can start the preparations for the Seder, not a minute before. Number 2, on Ma'ariv, like on every Motzei Shabbos, we say a Havdalah in Ma'ariv, not Atat Chonantanu, but as a very special insert called Vatodiyenu, in which we say the words Ben Kedushat Shabbat LeKedushat Yom Tov Hivdalta, that God, you made a distinction between the sanctity of Shabbos and the sanctity of Yom Tov. If you do not daven Ma'ariv, like a woman who's not obligated in Ma'ariv, and she would like to start her preparations for the Seder, then very simply she waits till the end of Shabbos, say 7:43 p.m., At 7:43 p.m., she says the words, Baruch hamavdil ben kodesh lekodesh, blessed be you who have made a distinction between the sanctity and the sanctity, namely the sanctity of Shabbos and the sanctity of Yontiv, and then she can begin her Seder preparations, which includes setting the table, warming up the food, and everything else. Since anyway we have a Seder in front of us, there's no immediate need to warm up food even sooner. You can put it on whatever you warm it up, and by the time you get the Shulchan Orech at your Seder, I'm pretty sure it will be, God willing, nice and warm. We finally get to the Seder table. We will ultimately say a very special Kiddush for Kaddish. It will include the words that the Chachamim coined Yak Nahas, Roshei Tevot, Yud, Yayin, Bori Priyagafen, Kuf, Kiddush, Asher Bachar Banu Mikolam, etc., etc., ending with the words Baruch Atah Hashem, Mikadesh Yisrael V'Azmanim. Then we have to make Havdalah on a candle. We couldn't use a candle on Shabbos, but we can use it by transferring fire on Yontiv. I instruct everyone to please, because of the halachos of Yontiv that we won't get into now, do not, I repeat, do not light a special candle for Yontiv, but rather take the Yontiv candles that your wife or you lit already by transferring fire, and ultimately use them for Havdalah. Use those candles in order to make Havdalah at the Seder. I also advise not to put them together as one, but put them close to each other. The reason I say this is because if you put them together and you take them apart, you may put them out. You may extinguish them, and that is a prohibition on Yontiv. So we definitely make a bracha of Borei Me'orei Ha'esh. We are up to, in the Yak Nahaz, the Nun, there, but I again advise, use whatever candle already lit and do not combine them together. Finally, we make Havdalah. We say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol, etc., etc., and we end with the words HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Kodesh. She made a distinction between the sanctity of Shabbos, the sanctity of Yontif, and finally Shechianu, and that's the end of Kaddish. We drink the wine, of course, leaning. One last little change at the Saturday night Seder that may or may not happen at your Seder. I'm pretty sure the Maxwell House Haggadah, whatever Haggadah you're going to be using, is going to determine this, but there may be a change on your Seder plate as well, and I'll explain. The Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim, Daf Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, says that we end the Magid with a beautiful bracha that's called Geula in the Mishnah. It starts with the words, Asher Ge'alanu ve'ga'alat avotenu miMitzrayim, you have redeemed us and our ancestors from Egypt, and thank God, after all these wonderful recordings and all these preparations, we have gotten to this evening, Saturday night, to eat matzah and maror. Here we are at the Seder, despite an Erev Pesach shechal lihiyot b'Shabbat. And in that bracha, within that Mishnah, in parentheses, in a regular Gemara, it says that, God willing, in the future, we'll come back to Jerusalem, we'll be eating the korbanos, and it says, amongst many things, v'nochal sham min hapsachim u'min hazvachim. We'll eat there from the Korban Pesach and from the Chagiga. Comes along Tosfos on that Gemara and says that the real girsa should be the opposite. V'nochal sham min hazvachim u'min hapsachim. Why? Because zvachim is what's called the Chagigat Arba'asar. On Erev Pesach, we would usually bring a Chagiga sacrifice as well as the Korban Pesach. What would we eat first, says Tosfos? We would eat the Chagiga first. Why? Shechagigat Arba'asar nechelet kodem la'Pesach lefi she'Pesach nechal ala Seudah. Just like today, we eat the Afikomen in commemoration of the Korban Pesach as the last possible thing we eat at the Seder. So too then, when there was a Korban Pesach, and God willing in the future, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to eat the Korban Pesach as the last thing we eat. So you have to eat the Chagiga, you get nice and satiated, and the last bite, the last gazayit, you leave for the Korban Pesach. Thus the proper girsa is, v'nochal sham, and we will eat there first, min hazvachim, the Chagiga of the 14th, and then min hapsachim, the Korban Pesach. The Mordechai concurs with the words of Tosfos saying, the zevach kodem Pesach, kedei sheyeh nechal ala Seudah. Indeed, the Chagiga comes first so that you eat it when you're satiated. I'll just add in parentheses that the Tzlach, the Tziyun L'Nefesh Chaya, does say that ultimately these are not the reasons. The real reason is Tadir v'Sheinot Tadir Tadir Kodem. We bring more Chagigas during the year. On every Yontif we bring it, and we will bring it the next day, meaning on Sunday, for and in honor of Yontif. So we bring more Chagigas on all the Shlosha Regalim than we do Korban Pesach. So Tadir v'Sheinot Tadir, what's more frequent, comes first. Regardless, the proper girsa, according to the Tzlach, the Mordechai, and the Tosfos, at the end of the day, is min hazvachim u'min hapsachim, and that's what it's written in most Haggadahs. First, Korban Chagiga, and then, of course, the Korban Pesach. However, this year we got a problem. The Mishnah Pesachim says, "Ematay mevi Chagiga imo." When do you bring the Chagiga on the 14th? Bisman, there has to be a few conditions. Amongst them is Bisman shehu ba b'chol, that there's a weekday. But if it's Shabbos, says the Mishnah, and mevini mo Chagiga, the Chagiga does not warrant the violation of Shabbos. Only the Korban Pesach warrants the violation of Shabbos. So Motzei Shabbos, when they got to the Seder, all they had was the Korban Pesach. They did not have the Chagiga sacrifice, so they had to get satiated on leftovers from Shabbos, or whatever it might be, but the Chagiga sacrifice they did not have. Now the next day, Sunday, they brought another Chagiga, but that Chagiga is not Chagigat Arba'asar, the 14th, but a Chagiga that you bring on every Yontif. On every Yontif, there's 3 korbanot that the Jewish people have to bring, and that is what's called Olat Rihiyah, Shalmei Simcha, and Shalmei Chagiga. So they will bring a Chagiga sacrifice the next day. From this perspective, comes along the Mahari Vayil. The Mahari Vayil was one of the primary Ashkenazic poskim. He was extremely important because he is quoted and requoted in Ashkenazic literature. His was born in 1456, literally at the end of the Rishonim period. He happened to be a Talmud of the famous Maharil, so in the Ashkenazi world, we hold from him. And he writes in his responsum, K'sheyavo Pesach b'motzei Shabbos, indeed, when a Pesach comes out on Saturday night, as it will this week, Az yomar min hapsachim u'min hazvachim, te'en chagiga kriva b'Shabbat. So you have to go in order. So every year we go in order. But since on a year like this, we're first going to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. That warrants the violation of Shabbos. And then we're going to bring the Chagiga on Sunday. So you have to change the order. And at that bracha, instead of saying min hazvachim u'min hapsachim, say min hapsachim u'min hazvachim. And in many Haggadahs, that's exactly what it says to do. On Saturday night, say this. This is the opinion of the Taz, quoting the Mahari Vayil. Indeed, he says, Tzarich lomar be'oto laila, you have to say on Motzei Shabbos, this week, min hapsachim u'min hazvachim de'en chagiga kreva b'Shabbat. And so concurs the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham also says that when Pesach comes out on Motzei Shabbos, you change the order and you say min hapsachim u'min hazvachim for that reason. However, The Knesset Yecheskel disagrees with this totally. The Knesset Yecheskel was not his real name, obviously. His name was Rav Yecheskel Katzenellenbogen. His years 1667 to 1749. He was an extremely important rabbi, because he was the rabbi of the famous three kehilot called Ahu, standing for Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbach. Three communities in Germany. That was a very prestigious position. And he wrote a responsum, and he basically says that Pesach did come out on Motzei Shabbos, and he heard of this Maharil, and he heard of this idea of changing the order, and he totally and utterly disagrees. He says Leita, which would be nisht, niet, no way. Why? The Anu mitpalelim v'shana haba niske. This whole bracha is that we're sitting here tonight in our Seders, but God willing, next year we'll be sitting in Yerushalayim on a bottom floor of a home within the old city walls. And that's what we're davening for. V'nochal sham, meaning in the future. We're not talking about this year in that bracha. We're talking about next year. After all, we're talking about korbanot, and there's no korbanot on the table. From this perspective, says the Knesset Yecheskel, ultimately, since we're talking about next year, ultimately you have to learn the Mahari Vayil, who said to change the order in a different way. The Mahari Vayil probably meant not to change it this year, as the Magen Avraham and the Taz understood, but rather change it the year before, namely last year, when we knew that this year, Erev Pesach Aliyot b'Shabbat, and ultimately on Motzei Shabbos, we will be in a situation where we'll only have potentially a Korban Pesach without a Korban Chagiga. That's when you change the order. But this year, too late, because look at the calendar. Next year, Erev Pesach is not on Shabbos. No one's going to listen to this YouTube next year. No one's going to listen to this recording next year. It will be irrelevant. So says the Knesset Yecheskel, if you want to change it the year before Erev Pesach Aliyot b'Shabbat, because we're not talking about now. We're talking about the future. Anyone that learned Diktuk knows that if you have Aleph, Hey, Vav, Yud at the beginning, that means future. So we say, Ken Yagienu, God, please bring us, just like you brought us to this Saturday night, bring us in the future to more Yomim Tovim, where we will have Korbanot. It will be more enhanced. So therefore, it says the Knesset Yecheskel, don't change anything this year. If you changed it last year, great. If you didn't, too late. This year, you don't change it. So on Saturday night, there's a machlokes. The Magen Avraham and the Taz says to change it, because if it was an Erev Pesach shechal liot b'Shabbat, and it was in Yerushalayim, and there was a Beis HaMikdash and a Mizbeach, indeed, there would be a Korban Chagiga after a Korban Pesach, and therefore you have to change the order to Min HaPsachim u'Min HaZvachim. The Knesset Yecheskel says, if you're going to do that the year before Erev Pesach Aliyot b'Shabbat. Not this year. This year is too late. We're talking about the future. So if next year Erev Pesach Aliyot b'Shabbat, change it the year before. From this perspective, I want to bring a nafkamina between them. And that is, do we put an egg on the Seder plate in commemoration for the Korban Chagiga? We just said that the Korban Chagiga, the 14th, namely Erev Pesach, was not brought. It doesn't warrant violating Shabbos, says the Mishnah. That being the case, my dear friends, if it doesn't warrant violating Shabbos, then maybe it shouldn't be on the Seder plate, because way back when, if we're commemorating what was, then ultimately on a Motzei Shabbos, a Korban Pesach we had, a Korban Chagiga we didn't have. So maybe this year you'll take your Seder plate and you'll have to put a big X where it says to put down the egg, which commemorates the Korban Chagiga. Indeed, says the Rosh, no more, no less, one of the greatest Rishonim, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, Tishachal Pesach liot bechad b'Shabbat, when Pesach indeed is Sunday, Shelo yavikim tafshil echad, you only bring the shake bone that commemorates the Korban Pesach, but don't bring the egg. De'en chagiga b'yom Pesach. When indeed it's Saturday night, on a Seder plate of the Rosh, there would be all the things except for the egg. The Hagaot Maimoniot, which learned in the same shir as the Rosh under the Maharam Mirutenberg, the Hagaot Maimoniot wrote glosses on the Rambam and basically disregarded what the Rambam said and brought the Ashkenazic minhag. And ultimately the Hagaot Maimoniot concurs because he learned by the same Rebbe. And he says, Keshachal Yodalet Liyot b'Shabbos, indeed, when the 14th comes out at Shabbos as it does this week, Yeshein Amosim Kim Tafshil Echad, all you do is put the shake bone and not the egg, the Chagigat Yodalet and Hakriva b'Shabbos. And indeed the Tur, brings a yesh omrim that indeed on Saturday night this week, don't put the egg on the table. However, the Torah got Maimoniot already. This, agreeing with his Chavrusa, the Rosh says, Omnam, I have to be honest. Piresh Harav Rabbeinu Yechiel, he probably means Rabbeinu Yechiel mi Paris, one of the Baalei HaTosfos. She'en lachush lezeh. You don't have to worry about it. Why? Number one, she'ina ela lezecher. First of all, it's only a zecher. It only commemorates what was. You don't have to be precise when you commemorate something. When you say something like, it's like when there was a Beis HaMikdash, you don't have to say, well, let's do it precisely like they did it there. A zecher is a zecher. You do it approximately. For example, in Korech, we do zecher lemikdash kehillel. So we put the matzah and the maror together. We don't put a piece of meat in there to remember the Korban Pesach. So the same thing here. You have a Seder plate. You remember the Chagiga. You don't have to be so pedantic that, oh, actually, on a night like this, if there was a Beis HaMikdash, there wouldn't be a Chagiga. The Hadarabba, he answered the other reason why you should put the egg. If you're so pedantic, from your perspective, it's like korbanos. And if that's like korbanos, then ultimately you got a very big problem. And the Torah concurs. The Torah quotes Rabbeinu Peretz, again one of the Baalei HaTosfos, for the same two reasons. First of all, it's just a zecher, and number two, if you want to be so pedantic, nirasho sekemin kotshim mamish. It looks like you're actually having korbanos on the table. We don't want that. We have an Ashkenazic minhag not to eat anything broiled, barbecued on the night of the Seder, so it shouldn't look like we're eating the Korban Pesach in the wrong place. You can only eat it in the old city walls and only on the bottom floor. Well, if that's the case, if you take off the egg from the ke'ara, then what are you doing? You're basically saying it's precisely and exactly like korbanos. No good. When you do a zecher, it's a zecher. A zecher means a commemoration. But if you're so pedantic, it looks a little too pedantic, too close for comfort. The Bach, even though he does bring this opinion and says, this is what the Rosh says, this is what Rabbeinu Yerucham says, at the end of the day, he says, Kol Achronim, all the Achronim. He doesn't mean the Achronim only, but he mentions many. Amongst them, the Mordechai, the Smak, the Hagaot Maimoniot. His Skimul Isvarat Harav Rabbeinu Peretz agreed with Rabbeinu Peretz, quoted by the Torah earlier, that you don't change the Seder plate. So I would like to suggest as follows. If you do not put the egg on the Seder plate, you should change the order of the bracha and say min hapsachim or min hazvachim, because it's a commemoration exactly and precisely like it was in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. If you do put the egg on the Seder plate, then I don't think there's any reason to change the order. The Knesset Yecheskel is probably correct, but even if he's incorrect, a zecher is just a zecher, and maybe when you make it too much like it was in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, then it could be dangerous. Why could it be dangerous? Indeed, this is something that none more, no less, was what bothered the actual Rosh. He said that if you go ahead and put it on, you may think that when an Erev Pesach Chal b'Shabbat, the Chagiga does violate Shabbos, just like the Korban Pesach. After all, last year we put both the egg and the shake bone on the Seder plate. I would like to suggest that indeed, in order for us, you can use the same logic and say, well, one of the reasons we put it on is to show that it's just a zecher. And we explain to everyone that it's just a zecher. At the end of the day, I'd say like this. If you're going to follow whatever Haggadah you follow, and you're going to change the order, then you should take the egg off the ke'ara. If you're not going to change the order and just leave it the way it is, then you can leave the egg on the ke'ara. I hope everyone enjoyed these recordings, and be'ezrat Hashem, everything will be done kehilchato, properly. The most important thing I'd like to say after all these recordings is no high nerves. God does not like high nerves. I heard from my esteemed Rebbe and mentor Rav Amital that on Friday nights, many Jews say between Shalom Aleichem and Eshet Chayil, a prayer starting with the words Ribono Shel Olam. In the middle of it, it says, Va'az eshmor pekudecha u'mitzvotecha beli eitzev. And then I will keep your mitzvos, God, beli eitzev. My Rebbe Rav Amital said it does not mean sadness, it means atzabim, which means high nerves. So Be'ezrat Hashem, we will follow whatever pamphlet will follow. We will have a wonderful Shabbos, doing everything properly, and then have a beautiful Seder, keeping all the halachos and having an enchanted evening. And Mirza Hashem, these 2 days or 3 days will be done not only kihilchato, but with great simcha, and Mirza Hashem, with security for Israel, with many hostages coming home, and in Mirza Hashem, God should bestow upon his Jewish people a Shabbat Shalom, a Chag Sameach in every which way, and in Mirza Hashem, I hope and pray that all of us will be together in that futuristic time where we will nochal sham min hapsachim umin hazvachim if a Erev Pesach chal lihiyot b'Shabbat.
בירושלים בבנויה, לשנה הבא בירושלים, לשנה הבא בירושלים, לשנה הבא בירושלים, אוי בירושלים בבנויה, לשנה הבא בירושלים, בירושלים בבנויה, לשנה הבא בירושלים, בירושלים בבנויה. לשנה הבא בירושלים, בירושלים הבנויה, לשנה הבא אוי בירושלים, בירושלים הבנויה, לשנה הבא אוי בירושלים, בירושלים הבנויה.